Pokémon FireRed and LeafGreen were released on Nintendo Switch just a few months ago, in February 2026, and official sales data from Nintendo has confirmed that they've sold exceptionally well. This is great news for Nintendo, obviously, but it could also be very good news for us as Pokémon fans. And so today, I just wanted to dive into that a little bit, taking a look at how FireRed and LeafGreen have performed sales-wise on Switch, and what this could potentially mean for us going forward. And let's throw a bit of cozy nostalgia in there too, shall we? Because how lovely has it been revisiting these classics on Switch? I adore FireRed and LeafGreen. So, if you're ready, let me know if you're Team Venusaur or Team Charizard in the comments below, and let's get into diving into these iconic Pokémon remakes. So, as promised, let's kick things off by looking at the official stats. So, the games launched on the Nintendo Switch eShop, available to play on both the original Nintendo Switch and the newer Switch 2 consoles on February 27th, 2026. I don't think their success will come as a shock to many people, considering they immediately rose to the top of the eShop sales charts. In fact, they topped the eShop charts in at least the US, UK, Japan and Australia before they'd even launched. That was just from people pre-ordering the games in the week leading up to that 27th of February launch date. But thanks to a recent financial report from Nintendo, we've now received our first official sales data to give us a clear picture of just how well the games have performed. So, as you can see from this page of Nintendo's report, the two versions combined sold more than 4 million units in their first 6 weeks on sale. So basically up until sort of early to mid-April. Nintendo hasn't shared any information on their sales since that date, but we can obviously assume that they've sold a fair few more copies in the weeks following that period too. Indeed, at the time of me recording this video, we're late into May right now, I've just had a look at the Switch eShop charts myself here in the UK, and both versions are still sitting very close to the top even now. So I'll explain why I think this is excellent news for us as Pokemon fans in just a moment, but let me just offer you some context here so that we can really understand this success properly. You may know this already, so bear with me whilst I explain it for anyone who might benefit from a refresher here, but FireRed and LeafGreen are remakes of Pokemon's very first games, which we in the West know as Red and Blue, but in Japan were called Red and Green, hence the names. These remakes first released on Game Boy Advance back in 2004, back in the glory days where all games were on cartridges and the internet hadn't completely taken over society yet, which will be important to remember in just a sec. Now, those original Game Boy Advance games sold a total of 12 million units in their lifetime, which interestingly means that they were actually just the worst selling remakes in the series. But of course, 12 million units is still huge. So when we go back to that statistic of 4 million copies already being sold on Switch, we can see that in just 6 weeks, these legacy titles have managed to sell another 33%, another third, of their lifetime sales, just by being made available again. They were being sold at a cheaper price point this time around, and as I just mentioned, now that we have the internet, there is the convenience of everyone being able to digitally download these games immediately from home this time around. But still, it all sounds so simple, doesn't it? Make classic games available to buy again, people will buy them. So as I said at the start of this is all very good news for us and Nintendo. In Nintendo's case, let's do the math here. The two games have been listed at $20 each. That's in the US. Obviously, pricing varies around the world and might be different depending on where you're watching from. They haven't been on any kind of discounted sale in that time, so 4 million copies at $20 each is, wait for it, $80 million in gross revenue. Now, Nintendo doesn't just pocket 100% of that $80 million, of course. And there are obviously costs involved in making ports of older games for newer systems. But let's face it, a casual $80 million and growing, quickly made out of some old games that you just had sitting on the shelf in your back catalogue collecting dust, is a pretty nice way to round off your financial year. It's also good news for Nintendo because of the fact that, as is often the case, an initial vocal backlash surrounding the game's release turned out to do absolutely no harm to their sales at all. If you spend unhealthy amounts of time browsing Pokemon discourse online, not me, of course, never. Then you might have seen that some fans and gamers in general weren't happy about the fact that these games were released as standalone games that you have to buy, as opposed to being included with the Game Boy Advance section of the Switch Online subscription, a service that offers plenty of other Game Boy Advance games included as part of that subscription at no extra cost. For me, even though I do have an active subscription to Switch Online, I was actually pretty happy to see these games get released individually, because I'd want them to be available to play on my console forever, not just until the subscription runs out or until Nintendo decides to just stop offering that service altogether. But even I can understand why some people were left frustrated at having to buy classic games separately when you are already paying for a subscription that's supposed to offer that for you already. From Nintendo's point of view, they now have confirmation that if a game is special enough, they can sell it outside of that subscription. Nintendo has publicly made a point of saying that doing so won't become normal business practice for them, and that they're still very much committed to releasing titles as part of the subscription, but that option will always be there to them, and now they know that it works. But anyway, sure, this is all lovely news for the multi-billion-dollar company. Hooray! But why is it good news for us? Why should Pokemon fans be so happy to see these games performing so well again in 2026? A quick note here just to say that if you're enjoying this discussion, please consider subscribing to the channel for more positivity-focused Pokemon chat. Thank you very much to anyone who does. But yeah, I think there are maybe 3 key reasons why this is great news for us. The first of those, which is probably the most obvious of the 3, is that this could obviously finally open the door to more classic main series Pokemon games being re-released in the future. For a franchise that's so big, so popular, and with decades worth of classic games that people still want to be playing even today, it's kind of baffling that for most of Pokemon's biggest classic games, there's just no way to obtain them legally right now. No way to give Nintendo and the Pokemon Company some money for the privilege of playing them. You can track down original cartridges on sites like eBay, of course, but there are risks with that, with people trying to sell fake copies and things like that. And if you're not morally against being a bit naughty, there are ways to play the games on emulators and the like. But obviously, neither of those methods generate any money for Nintendo and for Pokemon. So why don't they make more of these games available just all the time on whatever system is the current system right now? Maybe it's out of the fear that people will keep buying the old games and not bother playing the new ones, but I don't think that would be the case at all. So yeah, maybe, just maybe, seeing this wild success for FireRed and LeafGreen might just make them see a bit of sense and think that actually it's a no-brainer to give fans more of these classic games. Here's hoping. Reason number 2 is that if reason number 1 was to happen, a logical next step would potentially mean that we see Pokemon Ruby, Sapphire and Emerald released in some way on the Switch eShop in the nearish future. This is purely speculation, of course, but if Pokemon and Nintendo were going to be open about putting any other older games on the eShop, it should really be Ruby, Sapphire and Emerald next. If you've played the FireRed and LeafGreen Switch releases, you may have realised that it's actually impossible to complete the National Pokédex in those games, because on the original cartridges back in the day, you had to trade with Ruby, Sapphire and Emerald to get some of the Pokemon that were exclusive to those games. In these new Switch editions, there's no way to trade with those games because they don't exist on a modern format, a modern console. So as it stands, FireRed and LeafGreen on Switch are frustratingly incomplete. It might be that they just don't care about that and they're more than happy to just leave them incomplete. But you'd really hope that this has at least been thought about, and that at least the idea of also releasing Ruby, Sapphire and Emerald to make the experience more complete has been considered. With FireRed and LeafGreen doing so well, and perhaps surprisingly so, maybe doing slightly better than anyone might have expected, maybe that could be the push needed to make these other games happen. And the third and final reason is that it could well make for a much better integrated network of Pokemon games on the Switch family of systems. Right now, many Pokemon players use Pokemon Home, an app that essentially connects multiple Pokemon games together to create one unified Pokédex and to allow the ability to move Pokemon from one game to another. The process of getting Pokemon from classic games into home, and therefore being able to add them to your team in newer Pokemon games, has become increasingly complicated, especially with older transferring apps like Pokemon Bank on the 3DS becoming impossible to download anymore. So really, a new kind of refreshed way of communicating with classic games is kind of becoming necessary now. For that to happen, realistically, all of these games need to be published on Switch. FireRed and LeafGreen are a great start, but if their success results in more games coming to Switch too, it'll open up more and more ways for fans to catch them all, which is the whole point. And of course, by making all of these classic games compatible with the brand new releases, the new generations of Pokemon games, the classics can even be used as selling points for the franchise going forward. We have the next generation launching next year with Winds and Waves, and I don't know about you, but if I was told that these new Pokemon games are compatible with the classics you've been playing on the eShop, so you can trade your FireRed Charizard over and add it to your team, that can only be a positive, giving players more choice and more connectivity between the games that they've purchased. It could well be that FireRed and LeafGreen are just a one-off, and that they'll be left incomplete and that's that. But hopefully the success that we've seen will open the doors for more games, and hopefully this discussion has left you feeling a little bit more optimistic that some of your old favourite games will maybe make it to the Switch in future. Fingers crossed. Do make sure to subscribe to the channel for more fun, positivity-focused Pokemon chat just like this video. Be sure to catch my recent videos chatting about Pokemon Pokopia if you're interested, and as always, thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next one.